Good morning. I'm Jeff Hammond, the Executive Director at International Ground Source Heat Pump Association. Thank you so much for joining us for the November Dig Deeper webinar. This webinar is sponsored by Climate Master, manufacturer of water source and ground source heat pumps. We appreciate their sponsorship. We have an exciting topic this morning, which I'll get to in just a few minutes. I have some updates on the latest IGSHPA news, and then we'll introduce our speaker. This is the last Dig Deeper webinar for 2024. We are accepting abstracts for 2025. If you'll go to the website and click on training and events, you'll find the abstract form there. We're also accepting 2025 webinar advertising. This is a great way to get your name out. Since these are recorded, then your logo stays on these slides and in the recording for perpetuity. So it's a great, very inexpensive way to advertise. I'm sure you've by now heard about our 2025 conference in cooperation with Geothermal Alliance of Illinois. March seems like a long way away, but things are happening very, very quickly. And in fact, if you'd like to speak at the conference, we're accepting abstracts through the end of the month. So please submit those abstracts at your earliest convenience. We want to make sure we get the tracks all lined up and set up our final speakers. Also, you'll notice from this graph, it's quite a bit different from the last webinar we did. Only 24% of the blocked rooms are now available. We do have other hotels in the area, but if you want to just walk right from your room over to the convention center, the hotel where the convention is at is certainly convenient. So get your abstracts in, and hopefully you'll be able to speak at the conference. We couldn't do the conference without our sponsors. We sincerely appreciate all of our sponsors so far. We do still have some spots left. Some of them are completely filled, but there are some available. If you'd like to sponsor the conference, we would appreciate it. Same with our exhibitors. We have very few spots left now, so time is sort of the essence here. We could still do one 20 by 20, and we could do a couple of 10 by 20 booths, but there's not a lot left. At this point, we really appreciate the sponsors. This will be a great opportunity to have discussions with both the IGSHPA members as well as GAOI members and local community. It's at a great location in Champaign, Illinois, so it's easy to get to in the Midwest. Lots of talk about advertising here. Here's another one. Our Geo Outlook magazine, the January issue, is just about ready to be put together. Advertising is due December 1st. And this is the conference issue, the January issue is. So it'll be an opportunity if you're exhibiting or you're sponsoring to mention that in your ad. And this is a digital magazine. So again, it's up and around for as long as it's on the website, which is there's no plans on taking it down. So check that out. Also, we're accepting articles for July. Our new membership program isn't so new anymore. It was announced in January, but we had a lot of really good response because there's so many different ways to become a member or simply just be on the directory as a listing only. So check that out if you're not supporting the organization. There's lots of different levels now. We could use your help on the new databases, both on projects and licensings and CEUs. There's a form there to fill out. You're certainly the expert in your local area, so we could use your help in getting these databases filled. Also, if you haven't signed up for our annual general meeting of members, it's coming up quickly, December the 5th. It's a virtual meeting this year through Teams webinar, and you'll want to check this out. It will announce the new board of directors, there are new officers, all of the latest IGSHPA news will be at that AGM. If you'd like CEUs for your certification from this webinar, just send your email and your name in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll keep track of that for you. If you're watching this as a recording, there is a code that you'll need in order to get the credit for watching the recording. You do not need this code if you're watching this live, but if you're watching the recording, you'll need the code. It's just some housekeeping. If you would put your questions or comments in the chat or Q&A, and our speaker has asked to read those questions during his presentation. So I'll be reading those, and we'll answer those during the presentation, instead of at the end of it. We will be recording this session, and you'll be able to review that on the IGSHPA website, probably towards the end of the day or worst case on Monday. If you are trying to use chat and having some difficulties, you may have a message that comes up that looks like this. Make sure you accept the invite. If for some reason your security settings from your organization don't let you use chat, we have enabled Q&A. And worst case scenario, I'll be watching for raised hands. In case you can't use chat or Q&A, then I'll unmute your mic and you'll be able to ask that verbally. All right, just one more slide and then we'll introduce our speaker. This is a disclaimer and potential conflict of interest that we read in every webinar just to make sure that our speakers don't have those conflicts of interest. The upcoming presentation represents the opinion of the presenter and does not represent any official position, opinion, or endorsement of any products or services by IGSHPA or its members. IGSHPA town halls and Dig Deeper webinars are for member updates and education on the latest information in the geothermal heat pump industry and are not meant to endorse one technology or brand over another. It is a presenter's responsibility to disclose any conflict of interest or position that may arise in the content of the webinar. So with that, we thank Climate Master for sponsoring again, and let me introduce our speaker, Jacob Goldman. Jacob is a lead accredited professional and is the Vice President of Energy Tax Savers, ETSI. He has a Bachelor of Science in Chemical Engineering from the University of Buffalo and an MBA from the University of Maine at Orono. Jacob is the co-author of numerous articles published in Building Operating Management, Workshop Facilities Magazine, Unit Magazine, Green Lodging News, International Parking Institute, Corporate Business Taxation Monthly, and Thomson Reuters. He has presented to hundreds of corporations, architectural firms, engineering firms, accounting firms, and local chapters of USGBC, IFMA, BOMA, and AEE, as well as national conferences of NFMT, NAMCO, IGSHPA, PEMA, and at the EMC conference. Jacob has also been a consistent speaker at GE's Nella Park and Cooper's The Source in Peachtree, Georgia. It's a great presentation. Thank you, Jacob, for spending time with us this morning, and over to you.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you for having me. Thank you for that introduction. There's a QR code on the screen. You're going to want to take out your phones. You're going to want to shoot that QR code. It'll create an email. You hit send on the email and you'll get a copy of these slides. The reason you want a copy of the slides is because of all the links. We're going to send you all the links that are in the slide deck as well. So if you want a copy of the slides, shoot that QR code. And by the way, people of the future, the QR code always works. It always sends our most up-to-date slides. So if you're seeing this sometime in the future, you're not on the live broadcast, you're seeing it in the future, you can still shoot that QR code. And it'll auto-create an email, you hit send, and within 5 minutes, you'll get a copy of this slide deck. So please take your opportunity to shoot that QR code while it's on the screen. We're going to talk about the Inflation Reduction Act. In particular, we're going to talk about Section 48. We're also going to talk about, briefly, Section 48E. We're going to talk about Jeff's favorite topic, my favorite topic, depreciation, time value of money. Everybody gets really excited about depreciation. And we'll touch on 179D, which is a completely different tax incentive. So we have Section 48 and 48E, which are somewhat similar. Then 179D, which is completely different. And then you'll notice that a lot of these incentives have some bonuses, and those bonuses are related to prevailing wage and apprenticeship. Those are two separate things, prevailing wage and apprenticeship, and we're going to talk about prevailing wage and apprenticeship and how you meet those requirements. Last chance on the QR code, take out that phone, shoot the QR code. The email pops up, just hit send, and you'll get a copy of these slides. And with that, I'm going to dive right in. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to type it in the chat, and Jeff will read it off to me. I'll take a couple questions while I'm presenting, so it'll move right along. There are 26 different incentives, tax incentives in the IRA. I am not an expert on all 26. I don't know anything about sustainable aviation fuel. I don't know anything about second generation biofuels. I'm only going to be speaking on the ones in green. I'm not speaking on the other ones. And with that, we're going to start with Section 48, the alternative energy credits. Ground source is one of those alternative energy credits. Now, it's a misnomer that the IRA increased credits. As you know, historically, the ground source credit was 10%. the first thing that the IRA did is actually decrease the credit to a base credit of 6%. So where you used to have a 10% credit, now there's only a 6% credit. But what they did is they created a whole bunch of bonuses. And if you follow all the rules for the bonuses, your 6% turns into 30, your 30 turns into 40 potentially, your 40 could turn into 50. You can get a half off sale on your ground source project. So this has been very valuable. You know, you've probably already seen it. We've seen it where if you compare a ground source project to a conventional HVAC project, there are cases where the ground source project is the cheapest first cost when you include these tax incentives. So very valuable legislation to promote ground source, the inclusion of ground source. Thermal storage never had a tax credit, so it goes from a 0% credit to a 6%, and it can also go to 30, 40, 50%. Once again, you can get 2 ice tanks for the price of 1. You know, buy 1, get 1 free. So it's very valuable for some of these HVAC technologies, and then obviously for things like solar and the like, you can also qualify for them. Elective pay, Section 6417. This is probably the crown jewel, the gem of the IRA, which for the very first time, not-for-profits and state and local governments can get a tax incentive. They don't pay any taxes, but they can get a tax incentive through elective pay. So Section 6417 allows state and local governments, not-for-profits, Tennessee Valley Authority projects, Indian tribal, as well as energy co-ops, entities that never pay taxes, to get a tax incentive. And that tax incentive comes in the form of an elective pay. Now, there's one group that is not allowed this incentive, and that's federal projects. That'd be kind of like moving deck chairs on the Titanic, you know, Treasury paying the military, for example. So a federal project cannot get this elective pay, but state and local governments and all the subdivisions thereof can get it, and also not-for-profits. And here's the big news. The big news is everybody was like, well, has anybody gotten a check? 2 of our clients have already gotten checks. They got it in the last 2 weeks. They've gotten checks. Both of them happen to be solar projects, but we're talking about, like, one of them I know was like almost a $600,000 check for their solar project. So the checks have come out for elective pay. People are actually getting checks for elective pay. It's official. They pre-filed, they filed, and now they're holding the check. They're depositing that check in the account. So that this is a real incentive. The elective pay is a real incentive.
Pardon me, Jacob, we do have a couple of questions here, if you don't mind.
Sure.
One question, the first question is, can schools qualify?
Schools, the 2 parties that just got checks were school districts. Schools definitely qualify for elective pay.
Great. And the other one is, what's your sense of the elective pay surviving with the new administration? Seems most vulnerable. Yeah,
I'm going to give you a bad pun here. That's the elephant in the room. So basically, there were 6 different combinations that could have happened during the election between President, Congress, and Senate. This combination, this 1 out of 6, was the one that does increase the risk of maybe something happening, like reversal potentially. What I would tell you is, in August, 18 House Republicans sent a letter to the speaker that said, tone it down on the IRA. Our constituents are benefiting from this. They've reported that 60% of the benefits are going to red states. There are billion-dollar solar fabs. You know, Section 48 is a very solar-focused incentive. Ground source and thermal storage, for example, are kind of like the cousin nobody likes. They really emphasize solar, they really emphasize wind, and then they give very little guidance to us ground source and thermal storage enthusiasts. But what those solar fabs, there's like, I think 5 of them that are either just completing construction or in the midst of construction, and they're all in red states. So when you're in power, you have to look at a constituent in the eye and say, I know that job that you have was created specifically for this incentive, and I'm going to take your job away. I think they're going to have a very hard time, reversing this because of that aspect of it. Now, That being said, the Tax Code and Jobs Act that came out in 2017 has $4 trillion worth of expiring provisions in 2025. So what that unfortunately means is they're going to have to do some sort of negotiation on tax, and it's going to be big. And so that means everything's going to be on the table. So they're going to do a lot of horse trading in the next couple months. So I don't think it's going to get reversed, but I can't guarantee it either way. So I guess that's the short answer for that.
Thank you, Jacob. I figured that question would come up, and I know Ryan Dougherty at GeoExchange is planning on being in Washington a lot starting in January. So thank you so much.
Right. If you're in a red state, talk to your senator, talk to your congressperson, tell them how important this is to you, to your customers, to their constituents. That's how you bring their constituents to their offices and tell them how important it is. That's how you get votes against reversal. So I highly recommend that.
Thanks so much. I'll watch for more questions.
So elective pay, because this elective pay exists, there's some other requirements. So one of those requirements is you have to pre-register. When do you pre-register? You obviously pre-register after your project is placed in service. I'll repeat that. You pre-register after your project is placed in service. Your project finishes, you pre-register, you get a registration number, then you take that registration number and put it on a tax filing. So you pre-register after the project placed in service. Because state and local governments and not-for-profits got this special way to get tax incentives, they did put in what I call haircuts, things that reduce the credit. So all these credits here, 6%, 30, 40, 50%. Well, there's two potential haircuts if you're a state and local government or not-for-profit. The first haircut is how you're paying for it. If you use tax-exempt financing, there's a 15% haircut. What does that mean? If you qualify for a 30% credit, your 30% drops down to 25.5. So if you qualify for a 30% credit, 15% of 30 is 4.5, 30 minus 4.5 is 25.5. If you qualify for a 40% credit, it drops down to 34%. If you qualify for a 50% credit, it drops down to 42.5%. So if you use tax-exempt financing, there's a 15% haircut. The next haircut is sometimes called the domestic content haircut. It depends when you start construction. And so if you start construction in 2024, there could be a 10% haircut. There are ways to avoid it, but there could be a 10% haircut. If you start construction in 2025, there could be a 15% haircut. But I want to point you to 2026. If you're a state and local government or a not-for-profit and you start construction in 2026, there could be a 100% haircut. I kind of call that a head cut. The entire tax credit disappears in 2026. There are two ways to avoid any of these haircuts. The way you avoid it is the first one, be a small project, be less than 1 megawatt, be less than 3.4 million BTUs per hour heating, be less than 284 tons of cooling. That's one way to avoid these haircuts, by being a small project. And the other way you can potentially avoid this haircut is by meeting the domestic content requirement. So if you meet the domestic content requirement, you could potentially avoid this haircut as well. So there's two ways to avoid these 10%, 15%, or in 2026, the 100% haircut. And I do make a note here if you have a state or local project or a not-for-profit project that was placed in service in 2023, there is still a chance that it could still qualify for elective pay, and you could still, you're still potentially timely in filing for that 2023 project. There are some 2023 projects that will be dead, that there is no way to get the incentive. But some 2023 projects, you can still get this incentive for your state and local government customers, and for your not-for-profit, your tribal, and your energy co-op customers.
Jacob, John has a follow-up question on that. Seems you can pre-register at the beginning of the year that you complete the project. Any advantage to pre-registering as quickly as possible to get on the books with the IRS as a placeholder to elective pay being axed?
Yeah, so if the elective pay gets axed, maybe there would be some benefit. So I don't think it's going to get axed, but let's say it does. The most likely scenario of getting rid of it would be completely unfair to pull the rug under projects that are already placed in service, or pull the rug under off projects that are already in construction. The most likely scenario is a reversal that says, as of projects that haven't started by January 1, 2026, those projects don't qualify. So if you start construction before the end of the year, the most likely scenario is that any project started before the end of 2025 will be grandfathered in for a credit. That's the most likely scenario. They can do anything they want, but more than likely what they would do is base it off of start of construction, and it would be based off of start of construction before the end of the year. That's probably the most likely scenario if we had a reversal.
That's great to know. Laura has a question that you may have this in a slide later on, but are the haircuts only applicable to elective pay recipients, not
Yes,
corporate?
that is true. It's only applicable to elective pay.
Thank you.
So because of this 2024, 2025, 2026 thing, how do you define start of construction? So there's two ways to meet the start of construction requirement. One's the physical work test, one's the 5% safe harbor. On the physical work test, what we see on ground source is it's not the test boring. It's not the test boring. It would be a little bit of a stretch if you use the test boring as start of construction. But when you start drilling the bore field, that is usually a great indication of start of construction. That would clearly meet the physical work test. So you'd be good if you started drilling the bore field, you'd meet the physical work test. The other way you can qualify is the 5% safe harbor. The 5% safe harbor is a little tricky. If you were a cost-based accountant, which almost nobody is a cost-based accounting, if you were, just spending 5% would be good. And we wouldn't recommend 5% because sometimes projects go over budget. And so you'd want to be at 6% or 7%, because if at the end of the project your 5% turns into 4.9, you don't meet the 5% safe harbor. So I would highly recommend spending more than 5%. But that's cash-based accounting. Most accounting is accrual-based. And so you have to talk to that entity's tax department or accounting department to determine when they've accrued 5% of the project cost. So you would have to accrue 5% of the project cost in order to meet the 5% safe harbor. Physical work test is a little more straightforward. 5% safe harbor is a little trickier because of this accrual accounting situation. If you're a for-profit entity, you do have the ability to transfer your credit. So this is not available for state and local governments, not available for not-for-profits. It is available for for-profit entities. They can actually sell their credits. And we have located 7 different organizations that facilitate the transferring of these credits. And we're hearing that they're transferring about the 85 cents on the dollar range after you use include all the fees. And once again, you do have to pre-register. So a for-profit entity would have to pre-register, get their registration number, and then file. And included in the file would be who you're transferring to. And you'll transfer. And potentially you could use one of these 7 organizations, or you could do something internally with your accountant. You know, your accountant might have a company that is interested in buying your credits. And we're hearing they're going, net 85 cents on the dollar approximately. Real estate investment trusts are very interested in these transfers. They don't pay taxes at the corporate level, so they're very interested in these transfers.
Howard has a question about a project that's a mix of ground source and air source. If it's a total of 500 tons and 284 ground source, does that qualify?
So likely, and we're going to get to that in a later slide.
Okay, thank you.
So we start at 6%, but wait, there's more. There's the 5-time bonus. There are 2 ways to qualify for the 5-time bonus. One of the ways is by being a small project, under a megawatt, under 3.4 million BTUs per hour heating, 284 tons of cooling. There's some people going around that you don't have to add the heating and cooling together. You definitely have to add the heating and cooling together. You need to beat the heating and the cooling number. You have to meet both of those. If you're bigger than this project size, if you're bigger than 284 tons, or you're bigger than 3.4 million BTUs per hour heating, then the only other way is to meet the prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirement. Prevailing wage separate from apprenticeship, two requirements. And then in addition, if the way you're getting the 5-time bonus is through prevailing wage and apprenticeship, then you have to also meet, what happened? You also have to do prevailing wage for 5 years on any alterations and repairs. 5 years of any alteration or repairs, and there's a statement that you have to send into the IRS every year for 5 years, attesting that you did it for alterations or repairs, that you met prevailing wage. So that's the 5-time bonus. Now, how do you define a single project? So there's 7 criteria that define whether a project needs to be added together or not. If any 2 of these 7 are true, you have to add the projects together. So what do we see? Let's say you're doing new construction and you have solar panels on the roof and ground source in the ground. You might have to add those 2 together. You might have to add the KW of the solar and the tonnage of the ground source together. We're hopeful that IRS will reverse this, but we made comments to IRS after the proposed regulations, and hopefully they will reverse this. But right now, 2 different technologies might have to be added together if 2 or more of these things are true. So, for example, contiguous piece of land and master construction contract, those are definitely ones that tend to have an issue. Are we still connected?
We are. I can hear you great.
Okay.
We do have a couple more questions. One that on your previous slides, John asks if you know of any projects that have used transferability.
So none of our clients have used transferability. Our focus has been mainly on the elective pay, but we have talked to we've talked to these companies and transfers have occurred. So we have talked to these companies and transfers that occurred. What I would tell you on ground source is that I have not heard of a ground source transfer occurring. These guys are very interested in wind and solar. And once again, this whole universe is all concentrated on wind and solar. And that's what these guys are kind of concentrating on as well. So I have not heard of a ground source project being transferred.
Okay, good to know. And this is on elective pay. Laura asks, how realistic is it to be able to meet 100% domestic content by 2026? Are there market solutions that will make this possible and realistic?
Yeah, you don't need to meet 100% domestic content. You just need to meet the domestic content rules. If you don't, you get 100% haircut. So we're about to go into domestic content right now. So that was a great tee up for domestic content. Now, yesterday, we have some insiders that are really tuned in to the president. And we heard that new domestic content rules were going to come out today. We haven't seen them yet, but maybe today, maybe Monday, we're going to see new domestic content rules. And I'm crossing my fingers that maybe those will include a safe harbor for ground source. I'm not guaranteeing that. I'm just hopeful because I know that Ryan has been working with IRS on a safe harbor for ground source. But absent having a safe harbor, the way you qualify is if you have any structural steel or iron on the eligible project cost, 100% of that has to be domestically sourced and domestically manufactured. For manufactured product that isn't structural in nature, and by the way, for a ground source project, we're talking about grout, tubing, valves, pipes, manifold, vault, pumps, heat pumps, ductwork, air handler, VAV boxes, DOAS system, ERV system, diffusers. We're talking, the hangers for pipes. We're talking about a lot of pieces of equipment that are manufactured product. And overall, all that equipment, we have to get over 40% domestic for projects started in 2024. We think the law says that it's going to stay at 40%, but it is quite possible IRS is going to misinterpret the law and say, because the law for solar would have you do 40, 45, 50, then 55 in these different years. But that's not the law for ground source. But we think IRS is going to misinterpret it and probably subject ground source to these higher percentages as well. And so you're going to need to get your arms around the percent domestic for each of your manufactured product, all the way from the ground, all the way through. Now, that's why we're hopeful that there's going to be a safe harbor, and we're hopeful that that ground source safe harbor comes out, because that will completely simplify this process. All you'll have to do is look at the table, find out if that item on the table from the safe harbor was manufactured in the United States, and then you get to use the percentage that the table says, and then you just add those things up and get over 40%. So the domestic content bonus is a 2% bonus at the 6% level, but if you meet the 5-time bonus rule, the 2% turns into 10%. So very valuable domestic content. It's moving your 6% to 30 and your 30 over to 40%. So here's one of the ways that you can get a 40% incentive by meeting domestic content. And we're really hopeful that the safe harbor comes out soon, but we are hearing that some sort of domestic content regs or notices are going to be coming out imminently in the next day or so. And originally we heard that it was going to be today, but I didn't see anything come out today. But wait, there's more. There's another bonus. There's the energy community bonus. There technically is 5 ways to qualify for the energy community bonus, but the 5th way, IRS was unable to figure out how to find a data source. So there is only 4 ways. The first is brownfield site. So if you do a project on a brownfield site, then you qualify. Otherwise, they're all mapped based. So if your project happens to be in a census tract or adjoining census tract where a coal mine was closed since 2000, then you qualify as an energy community. If your project was in a census tract or adjoining census tract where a coal-fired plant was closed since 2010, you're in an energy community. If you're in an area with 0.17% direct employment from coal, oil, and natural gas, and that same area has higher than average unemployment, then you're in an energy community, and that is based on start of construction. Now, energy community bonus is, once again, it's a 2% bonus, but turns into 10% if you meet the 5-time bonus rule. Luckily, there's a map, not for the brownfield site, but there's a map for these other 3, and it's simply this URL, and I can just read this off to you here, 47D. You're going to want to get a copy of these slides, because then you'll get all the links to all these different websites. Brownfield sites, I'm not going to go over this, but you have it in the presentation. There are 3 different ways to be determined as a brownfield site. And this last one, I just want to point out, is just a phase 1 assessment that shows that there's a presence or a potential presence of a hazardous substance. And we have a situation where naturally occurring arsenic showed up in the phase 1, and we're trying to talk with IRS to find out if it's true, but it looks like the naturally occurring arsenic is causing that they meet this requirement for the phase 1 assessment, and therefore they're considered an energy community, even though it was naturally occurring arsenic as opposed to some sort of pollutant. So the map, here's the map. What I will tell you is the green ones are permanent. Basically, if you're in one of these greenish areas, you're going to have this bonus. The pink areas or the purple areas, they're going to blink on and off. And so once again, that start of construction is really important, because if you start construction in a purple area before it changes, you're grandfathered in. So when are they going to change? They're going to change in May. Every May, IRS is going to re-look at the employment data and determine whether that area has 0.17% of its work labor coming from coal, oil, or natural gas, and at the same time, that same area has higher than average unemployment. So these purple areas can blink on and off every May. So one of the things that you're going to want to do is make sure you meet the start of construction if you happen to be in one of these purple areas before May comes along.
Jacob, we have a couple of other questions along those lines. John wants to know if you're aware of anyone who's taken the ground source heat pump energy community bonus. Any of your clients or anyone you know of?
We have applied for them, but as I mentioned before, for elective pay, we've only gotten 2 checks. So we've only gotten 2 checks. We did have a commercial client that applied for it, and they just took the credit straight on their tax return. So the answer is yes. But for elective pay, we have not gotten a ground source one, a check yet. But the filing has occurred. The pre-filing has occurred and the filing has occurred. And we're expecting we're going to see a flurry of checks between now and the end of the year. And so we'll have a ground source project that qualified for energy community within that time frame.
Great. And Laura is asking about brownfield bonus. Would asbestos in an existing structure qualify?
Yeah, so I'm not an expert on a phase one assessment. This is all done by environmental engineers. They would be able to tell you whether it meets the requirement of as a hazardous substance. I think this is more about the earth itself, not what's in the building. So I do think it is more about what's in the earth.
Okay. Very good. I think I misspoke. It was energy community, not elective pay that John was asking about. Have you had?
Yeah. We have energy community bonuses received. Yes.
Okay. Perfect.
We filed. Okay. So here it is again. Here's all the incentives for Section 48, and for most technologies, Section 48 ends in less than a month and a half. And it switches over to 48E. Now, the one technology that stays in 48, and by the way, this might be the saving grace. Like there is reason to believe that potentially the fact that ground source stays in 48 might be a way that it's overlooked for reversal. So it could be really prescient that Section 48 ground source stays in Section 48. And so these technologies that switch over either switch over or they die. Ground source is the only technology that stays in 48. Everything else either switches over or dies. So CHP, for example, combined heat and power, we're pretty, it's pretty much dead because Section 48E is all about life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. And so CHP takes natural gas, makes steam and electricity generally. That would be a no-no for this clean electricity ITC. So there are things that get eliminated, and then things like solar, wind, battery backup, those things stay on for sure. So ground source, what is eligible on a ground source project? So clearly the bore field and the heat pump get 100% of their value gets to be applied against that 6%, 30%, 40%, 50% credit. But it turns out that ground source is the only technology that has specific guidance that says that the distribution also can qualify. So we're talking about VAV boxes, ductwork, air handlers, diffusers, all that equipment can qualify. There's something called the 50% cliff. So basically each one of those pieces of equipment, they look at where the energy is coming from, that flows through that piece of equipment. And so when you look at that piece of equipment on an annual energy basis, if the heating and cooling flowing through that piece of equipment is more than 50% on an annual energy basis coming from the ground, then that piece of equipment can qualify for the tax credit up to the percentage. So let's say you have a project where it's 80% on an annual basis from the ground and 20% from a backup gas boiler. That air handler that has that energy flowing through it, that air handler, the cost to install that air handler and hook it up electrically and put on controls, you get to take 80% of that cost for that air handler because 80% of the energy is coming from the ground. But let's say you have a situation where 45% of the energy is coming from the ground and 55% somehow is coming from the gas boiler on an annual energy basis, and that's heating and cooling energy together. There's some people out there saying that it's heat only. I don't see anything that would cause me to believe that it's heat only. We think it's heating and cooling. If it's 55% from the gas boiler and 45% from the ground, you fall off the 50% cliff and the air handler doesn't qualify at all. So you have to be above 50% coming from the ground. But if you're below it, you fall off the cliff, it doesn't qualify at all. But all that equipment now magically turns into ground source equipment and qualifies for the credit. So this is why it's so valuable. This is why we have seen projects when you include these incentives, that ground source is the cheapest first cost. Ground source is the cheapest first cost. A conventional equipment costs more when you include these tax incentives in the mix. Not 100% of the time, but we have seen cases where that is the case. So very valuable for the ground source industry.
Matt has a question on that. I guess just quantifying, is this energy or capacity, that 50%?
It is, well, so there's two different ways to do it. It's assesses either the aggregate maximum thermal output or as the maximum thermal output that the entire project is capable of delivering. And by the way, if this is a particular question, I'd be glad to shoot it out as an email. If you send me this question, I'd gladly respond with the actual, section and verse on where it's stated.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thermal storage does not have the distribution aspect to it. So if you're making ice during the night and cooling your building with ice during the day, the reason it doesn't is the first requirement of thermal storage is it's directly connected to the heating, ventilation, or air conditioning system, which means there's something called thermal storage and there's something else called HVAC. And so distribution is out for thermal storage. But the chiller is in because you need something that removes heat from or adds heat to a storage medium. The chiller is the item that removes the heat or adds heat to that storage medium. And the one other thing for thermal storage, it specifically says it has to be for a building. It has to be for a building. Can't be a swimming pool, can't be CHP, can't be a structural component. Placed in service. When do you get to take this incentive? You get to take these incentives when the project is placed in service. So if you're doing a generating project like solar, we typically use the permission to operate from the utility. That's when you're able to turn the meter back. You built your project, it's on the roof, for example, and then the utility gives you permission to turn the meter backwards. That's when we say the solar project is placed in service. But for thermal projects, if it's new construction, we often use temporary C of O. We sometimes use C of O. But if it's a retrofit, sometimes those are not things that are actually, part of the mix. And so we use substantial completion. Sometimes we use commissioning documents. So these are the types of things that we use to prove out when you place the project in service. So these are important concepts because these concepts define the year that you get to take the tax incentive. It's the year you place your project in service.
I think we had a couple of questions here on the distribution. Larry asks about, does the distribution apply to the heat pump only, or ductwork, zoning, products, et cetera? I believe it depends on that 50%, right?
Yeah, it depends. It's based on energy flowing through a piece of equipment. It's not just, you can't just take distribution as a whole. You have to look at the piece of equipment. First of all, is it directly connected to the ground source system? If it's directly connected, then you have to look at the energy flow on an annual basis through that particular piece of equipment. So, for example, we've seen DOAS equipment that is completely on an island. There is no reheat. There is nothing. There's no connection to it. It's just bringing in air and doing an energy recovery inside. That island, that spider, the central unit and all the ductwork, none of that qualifies. But you put in ground source reheat, and magically that DOAS system now is ground source equipment. But if you put it just on the general loop, and some of the energy comes from the ground source, but some comes from conventional, then you have to do the ratio. So it really depends on each piece of equipment that's directly connected to the system.
It's great to know. Laura had a question about thermal storage. I think you may have answered this on the chiller anyway. Does the piping, pumps, et cetera, connecting the storage and the chiller qualify?
Yeah, everything from the chiller to the tanks, and then maybe out to a heat exchanger. The heat exchanger would qualify. Some clients are wanting to take the coil all the way to the air handler. I think that's a gray area, and you could do it, but you definitely can't take the air handler. Okay. Can you take the coil? Yeah, kind of, but you can't take the air handler itself.
And Larry had a follow-up question on distribution. If we're using, let's say, floor heat rather than forced air, would that qualify? Would the radiant floor qualify?
As long as the energy flowing through it is coming from the ground, yes. Now, if you're using, Italian Carrera tile. We can't take the tile. You can take the winding loop in the radiant loop. That's about it. That's what you can take as part of the HVAC system. But if you're using, you can't take, expensive coverings on top of it. It's really just the HVAC system.
Great conversation. Thank you.
So this is Jeff's favorite favorite topic. It's my favorite topic. It's bonus depreciation. Now, this is not it. State and local governments, not-for-profits, they're not interested in this at all. This is just for your for-profit clients. They're interested. Basically, let's say we did a brand new office building. We put a package unit on the roof, ductwork, air handlers, VAV boxes, diffusers. All that equipment would be 39-year property. 1/39th a year for 39 years, a very slow way to depreciate. But you replace that package unit with ground source, and magically it turns into energy property, which is 5-year property, and all the ductwork and all that other stuff turns into 5-year property. The ability to accelerate the depreciation from 39 years down to 5, and then it turns out the story doesn't end there. Any property that's 20 years or less gets bonus depreciation. 60% bonus is 2024's bonus depreciation. They get to expense 60% of the project in year 1. Very valuable time value of money. So here's an example, a $39,000 project, and I made it really easy for me, $1,000 a year for 39 years. At the 35% tax rate, what is that worth in today's dollars? It's somewhere between $4,000 to $7,000 in today's dollars. But you move that to 5-year property and it goes to 12,000, or if you move it to immediate, it goes to 13,000. We're talking about, so you get the tax credit. Let's say you qualify for a 40% tax credit. What is the value of this? This is like an additional 15% credit. So the difference between what you could have done, which is 39-year property, and what you are going to do, that difference is almost like a credit, because you just take the percentage. So let's say we have about 7,000 here and additional 5,000 here. So 5,000 divided by 39,000. That ratio is like your credit. That ratio is like your credit. And so it could be around 15% additional. So the real value goes from 40% credit to almost like a 55% credit. So this is real money, time value money. Getting your money now is worth a lot compared to having to wait 1/39th a year for 39 years. And that brings us right into our next topic, which is 179D, completely different incentive. It is a tax deduction for commercial clients. It is a tax deduction in lieu of depreciation. You get to accelerate the depreciation. Instead of 39 years, you get an immediate deduction up to $1 limit. Now, if you're a designer of a government building, and this includes federal now, federal, state, or local, if you're a designer of not-for-profits, of government, of tribal, you as designer can get these benefits directly. It just comes out of thin air, and you can get this benefit directly. Very powerful legislation for the designers of government and not-for-profit and tribal projects. For commercial projects, it's an accelerated depreciation. It's the same time value money. Instead of 39 years, you get to take it immediately. Very valuable for commercial clients. We've done
really great information.
We've done 16,000 buildings. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. John had a question on the thermal energy network. He's asking about what other sources or sinks are eligible, for example, surface water or wastewater. I know there's a lot of discussion about wastewater, and that helps alleviate some of the drilling costs. How would that factor in?
Yeah, you need to meet the requirement of storage medium. So you have to have something that's a storage medium. Usually that's a tank. Wastewater, maybe it's a tank. Maybe you could call some sort of heat exchanger the storage medium, but you do need a storage medium. And once again, it is separate from the HVAC system. So you can potentially use thermal storage for some of these other items. Clearly, Congress really thought out solar, really thought out wind. They did not really think out thermal storage and ground source. They did not really define everything that you'd love them to define. So some of these other really energy efficient, really progressive energy efficient projects, I don't know that they specifically thought of it when they came out with the legislation. And at the end of the day, this is all going to be solved with case law. Somebody's going to take this incentive for something that isn't what people traditionally thought about, and then case law will define whether you're allowed to do that or not.
I think Laura said there's something in 48 that is along the lines of other underground source. Maybe that could be applied.
Yes, there is an addition there, but it does have to be underground.
Okay.
So it does, you could use a sewer pipe that's underground, but if you bring it up to ground level, then it doesn't qualify, which is craziness. But it's, the devil is in the actual words.
Okay. Thank you.
The IRA changed 179D. So once again, very similar to Section 48, it reduces the incentive. It went from $1.88 down to 57 cents to $1.13. But then once again, there's the 5-time bonus that could drive it up to 283.565. And how do you qualify for the 5-time bonus? Prevailing wage and apprenticeship. You got to meet prevailing wage and apprenticeship. They changed how this whole works. You used to be able to qualify for the lighting separate from the HVAC, separate from the envelope. That's not true anymore. You have to model the entire building. A 25% improvement gets you the minimum. A 50+ improvement gets you the maximum of these ranges here. And each year they've been increasing this by inflation. The retrofits projects, they can use a modeling method. The way you typically get the 25 to 50% is modeling your building against ASHRAE 2007. And if you model the building against ASHRAE 2007 and get these improvements, then you get these tax incentives. Retrofits can do the modeling method, but they also can do it by EUI. Energy use intensity, you get the EUI before your project, the EUI after your project, you compare the two, and away you go. What do we mean by designer benefit? Designers get benefits for all these building classes, all these government classes. Not-for-profits is brand new. All the hospitals, religious institutions, private schools, you get the designer is the one that gets this benefit. The designer didn't pay for any of these projects. They get the deduction directly. We have some designers that have not paid any income tax since 2006. They've wiped out their income taxes since 2006 just by designing energy efficiently for 179D. How do you qualify? You have to do a lighting, HVAC, or envelope project, which new construction obviously would fit that bill as well. And you have to beat a standard. We are lucky to have the standard of ASHRAE 2007 all the way out for placed in service through 2026. But if you place your project in service in 2027, you have to beat ASHRAE 2019. If you look at a universe of projects that qualified against 2007, let's say 100, 10 of them will qualify for 2019. And what I would tell you is ground source and thermal storage are some of the key technologies that we think will qualify against 2019. I think a lot of these other ones will no longer qualify against 2019, where ground source and thermal storage will qualify against 2019. So those will be the big winners when 2027 rolls around and you place projects in service in 2027 when you have to compare against ASHRAE 2019. What do you need? We need to model these buildings. So we need architectural, electrical, mechanical, plumbing drawing sets. If we don't have those, we need a full lighting survey. It doesn't matter that you just did an HVAC project. We need the lighting data. We need the envelope data. We have to model the whole building, and that's how you can qualify. Now, if it's a retrofit, the alternate way to qualify is with the energy bills using EUI. So 24 months before, 12 months after, we compare the two, and if you get the 25% improvement, you qualify. So 179D is affected by prevailing wage and apprenticeship. Section 48 also, if you're over 1 megawatt, over 284 tons, also prevailing wage and apprenticeship. Prevailing wage is the more straightforward one. You go to this website, you type in some information about your project, and it'll tell you what the wage and fringe that you have to meet is. So it'll tell you the wage and fringe that you have to meet. There's a form called the WH-347. It's the certified payroll form. you don't need to use that form, but that or equivalent is the kind of level of data that's required. We need all this data in order to confirm that you met the prevailing wage requirement, and the same data can be used for the apprenticeship requirement. There's actually 5 separate requirements in the apprenticeship requirement. So the first one is the labor hour requirement. This is the one everybody pays attention to, which is over the course of the entire project, 15% of the labor hours has to come from apprentices. But there are more requirements than just this one requirement. The next requirement is called the participation requirement. So any project, any contractor or subcontractor that has 4 or more workers on the life of the job, at least one of them has to be an apprentice. So what does that mean? It means that if you have a contractor that has 3 people on the job each day, but one of the days Jane Doe calls in sick and Sue Doe comes in to replace Jane, now you have 4 workers on that job and one of them has to be an apprentice. It's not a daily requirement. It is a life of the project requirement that at least one is an apprentice if you have 4 or more workers for each and every contractor and subcontractor. So those first 2 are floors. You have to be above them. But the next one, the ratio requirement, is a ceiling. You got to be below it. What they want here on the apprentice to journey work ratio, they don't want a bunch of apprentices running around unsupervised. So you need to be below it. If you had no apprentices, you would meet the apprentice to journey worker ratio. You wouldn't meet the other 2, but you would meet the apprentice to journey worker ratio. So on a daily basis, you have to meet that ratio requirement. So what's
Jacob,
the fourth?
Sorry. I want to be considerate of everyone's time here. I know you were gracious enough to stay after 11:30 Central. We have about 2 minutes left. So I just want to make sure and thank everyone for joining us if you have to leave at 1/2 the hour. But Jacob has agreed to stay past that time, and we certainly appreciate it. Laura has a question on 179D, and then John has another comment here.
So let's hold on those, and let me just finish because this is my last slide right here.
Oh, perfect. All right. So thank you.
So the other 2 requirements are the registered apprenticeship program has to be registered, has to be federally registered or state registered, and we have to confirm that Jane Doe is part of that program. So those are the other requirements. Jane Doe has to be an apprentice of a registered apprenticeship program, and the program itself has to be registered federally or state. There is a good faith effort exception. So if you make a valid request and it's denied, then you don't have to ask again for 365 days. If you make a valid request and it goes unanswered for 5 business days, you don't have to make another request for 365 days. If there is no registered apprenticeship program in your particular trade in that geographic area of operation, but you do have to prove it, you have to show that you've asked, and that would also meet the good faith effort exception. The rest of the slides are all appendix type slides. So this gives you all the information on what you need to have for the requirements to meet a valid request. You need to do all these things to meet a valid request. There are penalties. So this slide highlights what the penalties are for not meeting prevailing wage and determining whether you're not meeting, is it intentional or not intentional. This slide shows the penalties for apprentice. Not meeting the apprentice, and there's 3 different penalties there. And then this slide shows intentional disregard, what you need to consider if you intentionally disregarded the apprenticeship. With that, I put up our QR code again. I'll go back to it in a second, but there's a couple appendix page that when you ask for the slides, you'll get sample contract language for prevailing wage, for apprenticeship, for post project completion requirements, for domestic content. We have some sample language and then some information on actual code language that you might want to look at. So with that, I will leave it on this slide. The QR code on the right-hand side will get you the slide deck, and I'd be glad to stay around for any and all questions.
I really appreciate your time, Jacob. This is so timely with everything that's going on right now, and the questions have just been great. So Laura has a question about nonprofits. Is there any means for a nonprofit to make an agreement to monetize some portion of 179D taken by others in order to fund the project?
Yeah, so 179D was really designed as a designer benefit. It is real. They wanted to incentivize designers to step up their design, and it's really defined as a designer benefit. That being said, we have seen contracts. Where do you want to do this? You want to do this where the designer might have given you a little bit of a discount on their fees, knowing that the designer will get 179D. There is no mechanism for a not-for-profit, a state, a federal, any government. There's no mechanism for them to get this 179D directly. And the reason we know that is IRS created elective pay. Not IRS, Congress created elective pay. Congress was well aware of a way to give incentives directly to a party like a not-for-profit or a state and local government. But they chose not to do that for 179D. They specifically chose not to give a direct elective payment on 179D. They really wanted to incentivize designers to step up their design. So it really is a designer benefit. If Congress wanted to create a scenario where the state or local government and not-for-profit got it directly, they could have done that. They know all about it. They created one in elective pay, but they didn't do that for 179D. So it really is about a designer benefit. But could you negotiate ahead of time for a discounted rate? Yes, you probably could do that.
Great. Okay. What great discussions here. John is asking about a White House guidebook. He says there's some language on the White House guidebook. Page 14 says under period of eligibility, projects beginning construction before January 1st, 2025. Do you know what that January 1st, 2025 is referring to, or have you seen that White House guidebook?
I haven't, but John, there's my email. Don't hesitate to shoot me that guidebook, and I'd be glad to read it and see if I can figure out what it was referring to.
Okay, very good. I don't see any more questions at this point. I think we covered a lot of ground in such a short amount of time. I really appreciate your time, Jacob. I really appreciate everyone attending our November Dig Deeper. Do you have any closing thoughts, Jacob, and guidance for members?
Yeah, two parts. First part is people of the future. You can use that QR code. It will always be available and will always give you the most up-to-date slide deck. So don't hesitate to use that if you're watching this on the recording. The second thing I would say is if you're in a red state or your congressperson is a Republican, reach out to them. Tell them how important this is to you, how important it is to your customers, and how important it is to their constituents. And bring them down. Bring them in front of them, and tell the congressperson that this is important. That is how you save legislation from being reversed, is by emails, by phone calls, by attending in person. That's the way to make sure that this very important incentive stays in place.
Excellent. All right. Well, thanks again, and I really appreciate everyone. Thanks for your time, Jacob. This recording will be on IGSHPA.org in either late today or early Monday. And stay tuned for more news from IGSHPA. Hope to see everyone at the conference in March. Thanks. Have a great weekend.